Welcome to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Today we're diving into a really important part of international policing, transitioning capacity building and development activities, or CBD as it's often called. I know what you're thinking, transition kind of sounds like the end, but really it's more like a beginning.
It's about making sure that the work that we do as police advisors has a lasting effect, even after we're not directly involved anymore. It's a shift in responsibility from the advisor to the national counterpart or another actor.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we say transition in this context, what are we really talking about?
Specifically, the handover of a CBD activity to local authorities or partners. It's not about pulling out of a country or region completely. It's more about strategically changing our role within a specific activity.
So it's more focused and nuanced than just packing up and leaving.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that might make this kind of transition happen?
There are a few. The most obvious one is when we actually achieve the goals of the CBD activity. When we hit the target outcomes, it just makes sense to hand over responsibility to the local people.
Right, of course. But I imagine there are times when a transition might be necessary, even if we haven't fully reached those initial goals.
Absolutely. Big changes in the country's situation, whether it's political, security, or legal, can make a transition necessary, like a shift in the government's priorities. Or if a conflict suddenly gets worse, we might need to reassess what we're doing and adjust our level of involvement.
It sounds like being flexible and responding to the local situation is super important.
It really is. And of course, sometimes the national counterpart themselves will do things that can trigger a transition. If they're really committed to taking ownership and making things sustainable, we might speed up the handover process.
So it's dynamic. We have to manage it carefully, tailor it to each specific situation. This brings us to a big question. What are the key principles that can help us have a smooth and successful transition?
4 principles are key. First, early planning. We have to be thinking about transition from the very start of a CBD activity, thinking about different scenarios and making our plans flexible.
So it's not something we tack on at the end. It's part of the process right from the beginning.
The second principle is integration. To transition a CBD activity well, we need to coordinate with everyone involved, not just our own team, but also other international organizations, government agencies, and local stakeholders.
I can see how that would be critical, especially when you have a lot of different people involved.
The third principle is local ownership. The success of any transition really comes down to whether the local people are willing and able to take ownership of the activity and keep it going over the long term. This means we need to involve them early on and give them the power to take the lead.
It's like that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly. And finally, communication. Transitions can often lead to uncertainty and different expectations among stakeholders. Clear and consistent communication from leadership is essential to managing those expectations and making sure everyone is on the same page.
It sounds like communication is the glue that holds everything together. So we've talked about the why and the how of transitions. Now let's look at the who. Who are the key players in this process, and what are their roles and responsibilities?
Usually the decision to start a transition is made by the head of the police component. They'll talk to the CBD advisor who is responsible for the activity. Together, they assess the situation and decide the best course of action.
So it's a collaborative decision,
Yeah,
but ultimately the head of the police component makes the final call.
that's right. Once that decision is made, the CBD advisor has a few key responsibilities: engaging with leadership and stakeholders, coordinating the conversations about the transition, keeping everyone updated on progress and any challenges that come up.
It sounds like a role that requires diplomacy, communication, and project management skills all at the same time.
Definitely. The advisor has to build consensus, manage expectations that might be different, and communicate clearly and consistently. This is especially important when you're working with a lot of different groups: national law enforcement agencies, civil society representatives, donor countries, and regional organizations.
Now let's talk about the practical side of the transition. What does assessment and planning look like?
Assessment and planning are the foundation of a successful transition. Ideally, we build this integrated approach right from the start of any CBD activity. We have to set clear objectives, performance measures, and benchmarks from the very beginning, and those should be reviewed and adjusted as we go.
Flexibility seems to be a theme here. It sounds like transitions are rarely straightforward.
You're right. Plans for the transition phase have to be adaptable. We have to accommodate unforeseen political or security changes. Contingency planning based on different scenarios is also crucial. There are so many uncertainties when it comes to transition.
And what about human rights and gender considerations during the assessment and planning stage? I imagine those are crucial elements to think about, especially in places that are fragile and affected by conflict.
You're absolutely right. Human rights principles have to be at the center of every stage of capacity building and development, including the transition phase. Similarly, gender analysis is vital to assess how the transition might affect women, men, girls, and boys.
So it's about making sure our approach to transitions is inclusive and sensitive.
Precisely. The transition plans should also align with other CBD plans, concepts, and results-based budgeting. A phased handover of tasks is usually the best approach. It allows us to gradually reduce our involvement while still monitoring progress and the capacity of our local partners.
This makes sure the handover is smooth and reduces the risk of disruptions. Now let's talk about a critical question. How do we make sure that the progress made during a CBD activity keeps going, even after the transition? How do we guarantee sustainability?
That's a great question. It's something we need to think about carefully. To achieve and sustain progress, we often need continued political and financial commitment even after the initial transition.
So it's not just about handing over control, it's about creating an environment where the work can thrive.
Transition plans should address these long-term resource needs and incorporate gender-responsive budgeting to make sure there's ongoing support. This makes sure that resources are used effectively and that the needs and priorities of all genders are considered.
This is obviously a complex topic with a lot of layers.
Yeah.
In the next part of our discussion, we'll dig deeper into the practical side of the transition process. I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to see how these concepts work in real-life situations. Maybe you could walk us through an example to show how the process works.
Sure. Let's imagine we've been working with a national police force to help them get better at responding to gender-based violence. Our goal has been to improve their investigation techniques, make them more sensitive in how they handle these cases, and strengthen their partnerships with groups in civil society who are already working in this area.
Okay, so we have a clear goal and a specific area we're working on. What are the first steps towards transitioning this activity? Where do we even start?
The first step is always a thorough assessment. We need to evaluate how much progress we've made towards reaching our goals, identify any gaps that still exist, and figure out how much ownership and commitment there is within the national police force. It's also important to consider the bigger political and social context, to anticipate any challenges or opportunities that might come up.
So we're not just looking at the technical skills and knowledge that have been transferred, we're also looking at the things in the environment that could affect the long-term success of the transition.
Exactly. And this assessment shouldn't be done alone. It needs to be a collaborative effort. We need to involve the National Police Force, relevant government ministries, civil society organizations, and any other international partners who are working in the country. The goal is to get a complete understanding of the situation and make sure everyone is on board with the plan for transition.
It sounds like open communication and a shared understanding of the goals are really important from the very beginning.
Absolutely. Transparency and being willing to listen to different viewpoints are crucial for building trust and a sense of shared ownership. Once we have a clear picture of what's happening on the ground, we can start developing a specific plan for the transition.
What would that plan usually include? What are the key things we need to think about?
The plan would lay out a phased handover of responsibilities. We'd start by gradually transferring tasks from the advisor to the national police counterparts. This could involve mentoring national officers, embedding them in joint operations, and slowly giving them more decision-making authority.
So we're empowering them, giving them the skills and confidence they need to take ownership of the activity.
The plan should also include ways to monitor and evaluate things as we go. This lets us track our progress, spot any new challenges, and make changes along the way. Being flexible and iterative is really important. Transitions are rarely linear or predictable.
It's like navigating a ship through uncharted waters. We need a course, but we also need to be ready to adjust our sails depending on the winds and currents.
That's a great analogy. Now let's talk about sustainability. How do we make sure that the improvements we've made during the capacity building phase don't disappear after the transition? This is probably the toughest part of the whole process.
I agree. Our ultimate goal is to have a lasting impact, not just a temporary improvement.
Right. Sustainability depends on a few key factors. First, the National Police Force needs to have the resources they need people, money, and materials to continue the work after the advisors leave. This might mean advocating for a bigger budget, helping them get funding from donors, and helping them develop systems for procurement and logistics that will work in the long term.
So it's about giving them the tools they need to keep things going on their own.
It's also important to encourage a culture of continuous learning and improvement within the National Police Force. This could mean encouraging peer-to-peer learning and creating ways for them to share best practices and lessons learned.
So it's about moving beyond the initial training and creating a system where they can continue to learn and grow.
Precisely. And finally, we can't forget about political will and commitment. Sustainable change needs support from the highest levels of government. Without that support, even the best plans can fail.
We need to make sure the police force has the political backing they need to do their job effectively.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to engage with government leaders throughout the transition. We need to advocate for the reforms that are needed, make sure the police force has the resources they need, and create a political environment that supports sustainable change.
This shows how important communication and relationships are, not just with the police force, but with the whole political landscape.
You're right. Successful transitions depend on strong partnerships and a shared vision for a more secure and stable future.
This has been a really helpful discussion on the practical side of transitioning capacity building and development activities. I'd like to shift our focus to the challenges and opportunities that advisors often face during this process. Transitions aren't always easy, but they also offer unique chances for growth and learning.
That's true. Transitions can be complex and demanding, but they also give us valuable insights and the potential to make a real difference.
Now let's focus on the challenges and opportunities that often come up during this crucial phase.
Yeah, transitioning these activities is rarely simple. There are always going to be complications and potential problems that we need to be aware of. But even with those challenges, there are great chances for growth, learning, and ultimately making a bigger impact.
Let's start with one of the common challenges that advisors face during transitions. What are some of the things that can trip people up?
One of the most common is managing expectations. Transitions can create all sorts of expectations among different stakeholders. The host nation might expect instant results, while donors might be focused on strict deadlines and deliverables. Balancing those different and sometimes conflicting expectations requires clear communication. We need to make sure everyone understands what's realistic and what we can actually achieve.
That makes sense. Finding that common ground and setting achievable goals that everyone agrees on. What other challenges can you think of?
Resistance to change within the host nation's institutions can be a big hurdle. The way things have always been done, bureaucracy, and a hesitation to try new methods can all slow down progress. To deal with this, advisors need to encourage open discussions, actively involve local counterparts in making decisions, and show them how the proposed changes will actually benefit them.
It's about convincing people, not just forcing new procedures on them.
Exactly. And of course, making capacity building efforts sustainable in the long term is always a challenge. Building true local ownership is key. Empowering local actors to take charge, giving them the resources and skills to keep things moving forward once external support fades away, fostering a sense of pride and commitment to the work.
So we're aiming for self-sufficiency, not just a temporary solution.
And we have to remember that the environments we work in can be unpredictable. Advisors might run into unexpected situations like political instability, security setbacks, or funding cuts. Being flexible and adaptable is crucial. Transition plans should be constantly evolving. We need to be ready to make revisions based on the situation on the ground.
It sounds like resilience and thinking on your feet are important qualities for anyone in this line of work.
Absolutely. Now, even with all these challenges, it's important to remember that transitions also bring opportunities. They give us a chance to pause and evaluate how effective our capacity building work has been. We can see what worked well, learn from our mistakes, and improve our approach for the future.
So transitions become learning experiences, not just the end of a project.
They also give us a platform for strengthening partnerships. The collaborative nature of the transition process helps build stronger relationships between advisors, local counterparts, and other stakeholders. These relationships based on trust and mutual respect are essential for achieving results that last.
It's about creating connections that go beyond the current project, a network of support that will help with long-term success.
And perhaps most importantly, successful transitions can empower local actors. Give them a sense of ownership and pride in what they've accomplished. This can have a ripple effect, inspiring further progress and creating a culture of self-reliance within the host nation's institutions.
So transitions done right can be real drivers of positive change. They represent a shift in who's in charge, but not a disengagement. A commitment to supporting our partners as they work towards greater security, stability, and effectiveness.
That's a great way to put it. Transitions are a vital part of the capacity building and development cycle. By embracing the challenges and using the opportunities they provide, we can maximize our impact.
Thank you for joining us as we explore the process of transitioning capacity building and development activities. We hope this discussion has been helpful and will equip you to handle this complex process. This has been the International Policing Podcast on Capacity Building and Development. Until next time, stay safe and stay involved.